They stopped Darius Whitmore at the velvet rope because his hands were stained with grease and his suit looked borrowed. Inside, billionaires prepared to bid $12 million for the legendary Black Comet, a car Darius had rebuilt bolt by bolt after everyone else declared it dead. The auction director mocked him, security shoved him back, and the hammer rose above the final bid. Then Darius pulled one document from his pocket, walked onto the stage, and signed his name beneath the engine serial number. Within seconds, lawyers stood, bidders shouted, and the auction collapsed around a secret nobody expected. Stay to the end, because one hidden signature would expose who truly owned the car and who had built their fortune on a lie. The evening of the annual Voss Crown Auctions Gala arrived wrapped in gold light along the Charleston Harbor, where a line of gleaming vintage automobiles waited outside a hotel that smelled of champagne and old money. Bankers, senators, sons, and minor celebrities stepped from chauffeured cars beneath a storm of camera, flashes their names already printed on laminated badges waiting inside. Darius Whitmore arrived in an old pickup truck with a dented tailgate, wearing a charcoal suit he had owned for nearly a decade, and shoes that were clean, but clearly worn. He carried a brown leather envelope pressed close to his ribs, and beneath his fingernails there remained faint traces of engine grease from a transmission he had repaired only hours earlier for an elderly client. He walked toward the entrance with the same steady calm he carried into every garage bay, unaware that the calm would soon be mistaken for something it was not. At the check-in table, a young attendant glanced at his suit, his shoes, and his hands, then told him the delivery entrance was around the side of the building. Darius explained without raising his voice that his name was connected to the vehicle scheduled to cross the auction block that night. The attendant did not open the guest registry to check. Instead, she reached for a radio and called for security, her eyes already sliding away from him, toward the next limousine pulling up outside. It was at that moment Meredith Voss stepped out from the lobby sharp, in a tailored blazer, scanning the crowd the way a general studies a battlefield. Darius recognized her instantly from magazine profiles about Voss Crown auctions, but to Meredith, he was simply a stranger in a suit that did not belong among the diamonds and tuxedos filling her lobby. He told her plainly that he needed to enter before the Black Comet reached the auction floor, and asked her to check the ownership file connected to the car. Meredith assumed he was a former mechanic, hoping to attach himself to a famous machine for a moment of attention, one of the strays who occasionally tried to slip into high-value sales, hoping for a payout or a headline. She told him the event was reserved for verified guests, not for garage workers looking to tell stories about a car that had nothing to do with them anymore. A few nearby guests turned to watch, and someone laughed under their breath when Meredith referred to him only as the man who fixes cars, as though his profession disqualified him from the conversation entirely. Darius did not raise his voice or reach for the envelope. He simply asked her one more time to look at the registry before the sale began. Meredith refused, waving a hand toward security, more concerned with the optics of a grease-stained man near her champagne fountains than with the substance of what he was trying to tell her. Two guards took Darius by the arms and guided him firmly toward the edge of the red carpet, past rows of onlookers who assumed he had tried to sneak into a party far above his station. A woman in a fur stole pulled her clutch bag closer to her chest as he passed, and a young man filming the arrivals for his own amusement turned his phone toward Darius, as though he were the evening's unexpected entertainment. Nobody asked his name. Nobody asked why a man who moved with such quiet certainty would bother pushing his way into a room where he so plainly, by their measure, did not belong. Through the glass doors, Darius caught a glimpse of the Black Comet being wheeled into the display hall under soft, white light, its long black body gleaming like something carved from midnight. His calm expression cracked for just a moment when he noticed a modified panel near the rear fender, a change that had never been approved by the man who had spent months resurrecting every inch of that machine. He pulled out his phone and dialed the number of Graham Sloan, the attorney who had represented the Langford estate since before the restoration was ever finished. But the call was declined before it finished ringing. Standing at the curb with his envelope still pressed to his chest, Darius looked at the closed doors and told the guard beside him, in a voice too quiet for the crowd to hear, that when the hammer fell inside that room, everyone present would become a witness to fraud. Inside the display hall, Meredith took the small stage beneath a chandelier the size of a compact car and introduced the crown jewel of the evening, a 1967 Harrington V12 Black Comet prototype, the only surviving experimental chassis from a racing manufacturer that had collapsed more than 5 decades earlier. The car's silhouette was long, low, and sharpened like a blade, its matte black paint absorbing the spotlights rather than reflecting them, and its hand-built 12-cylinder engine was the last of its kind anywhere in the world. Meredith told the crowd the vehicle belonged to the private collection of the late Everett Langford, describing its dramatic recovery after decades of decay. Yet she deliberately avoided naming the person who had actually brought it back to life. Large screens flanked the stage, showing before and after photographs of the restoration. And in every archived image, the face of the man standing beside the shattered chassis had been carefully cropped out of frame. In the hallway outside, watching through a service monitor, before he was finally escorted away, Darius saw his own missing image flash silently across the screen, like a ghost erased from history. The story behind that missing face began 12 years earlier, when Everett Langford arrived at Whitmore Heritage Motors, with nothing but a burned frame, a shattered engine block, and several wooden crates filled with unidentifiable fragments of metal. 3 larger restoration companies had already turned the project down, claiming the car had no surviving blueprints and no realistic path back to functioning condition. Darius spent months studying archival photographs, old patent filings, and faint tool marks pressed into surviving steel, slowly reconstructing a machine that existed almost nowhere except in fragments and memory. He wrote letters to retired machinists who had once worked at the long-defunct factory, tracking down men in their 80s who still remembered the sound the engine made on a test track decades before Darius was even born. He built custom tools by hand, re-engineered the drivetrain from scratch, and recreated dozens of components using techniques nearly forgotten by modern manufacturing, working nights and weekends, long after his paying customers had gone home. There were entire winters when Darius slept, only a few hours a night, curled on a cot in the corner of his garage beside a space heater, because he refused to let the metal grow cold on a component he was close to finishing. His wife at the time worried he had fallen in love with a machine more than with his own life. And in some ways, she was not entirely wrong. Though what Darius loved was not the metal itself, but the idea that something broken beyond recognition could still be made whole through patience and honest labor. When Everett admitted he could not afford to pay the full cost of such an undertaking, he offered Darius something rarer than cash: 51% ownership of the finished car in exchange for the labor, the design work, and the passadis. Enormous personal investment required to save it. Darius agreed to the arrangement on one condition: that Black Comet would never become a hollow trophy, passed between speculators chasing profit rather than meaning. The 2 men signed the agreement in front of a notary public, each keeping a copy, sealing a bond that had nothing to do with sentiment and everything to do with respect for what the machine represented. When the restoration was finally complete, Everett insisted that Darius engrave his own name on the inner casing of the engine block, so history would forever record the truth of who had brought the car back from ruin. Now, standing behind the auction stage decades later, the announcer confirmed to the crowd that the vehicle belonged entirely to the Langford estate, a claim built on documents Darius immediately recognized as resting on a forged foundation. He tried calling Meredith once more, but by then, his number had already been blocked by event staff working directly under Graham Sloan's instructions. The auctioneer's voice rang out across the hall with the opening bid: $6 million. 3 paddles rose almost instantly, and Darius, standing just beyond the glass doors with his phone still warm in his hand, understood that only a handful of minutes remained before an illegal transfer would become permanent in the eyes of the law. Determined not to let a locked front door decide the outcome, Darius circled toward a side entrance reserved for technical staff, where he encountered a sound engineer who had once brought a stalled sedan to his garage on a rainy afternoon. Years earlier, the technician recognized him immediately and vouched for his identity to the staff supervising backstage access, allowing Darius to slip quietly into the service corridor behind the display hall. Word of his presence reached Meredith within minutes, and she arrived furious, convinced he had deliberately snuck past security to disrupt her event. In front of a cluster of wealthy guests, sipping wine near the green room, she asked him bluntly whether he was simply trying to extract payment from a dead man's estate. Darius answered evenly that the issue was never about payment. The issue was that Black Comet did not belong entirely to the Langford estate in the first place. Meredith demanded proof, and Darius lifted the brown envelope, but before he could open it, Graham Sloane appeared and inserted himself directly between them. Graham announced with practiced confidence that any agreement Darius once held had expired the moment Everett Langford passed away, insisting that Darius had already been paid in full and retained no remaining claim to the vehicle. Darius stated plainly that he had never received any such payment, not a single dollar, and that no legitimate transaction of that kind had ever occurred. Graham produced a receipt bearing what appeared to be Darius's signature documenting a supposed sale of all ownership rights for $850,000. Darius studied it for only a few seconds before recognizing it as an obvious forgery, and he calmly listed 3 separate flaws for everyone standing nearby to hear. The slant of the capital letter in his last name curved in a direction he never used. The date on the receipt fell during a week he had spent at an industry exhibition in Detroit, with dozens of witnesses, and the engine identification number listed did not match the true serial code stamped inside. Black Comet's chassis. Meredith refused to let him finish, accusing him instead of trying to sabotage the reputation of her auction house in front of paying clients. One guest remarked loudly that men like him always seemed to appear whenever a multi-million-dollar item hit the market, and a ripple of laughter followed the comment through the crowded room. Darius looked directly at Meredith and asked whether she had actually inspected the vehicle herself or only inspected the number it might bring in front of a room full of bidders. Unwilling to appear weak in front of her most powerful clients, Meredith ordered security to remove him from the building entirely. As a guard gripped his arm, the leather envelope slipped from Darius's hand, spilling a duplicate copy of the original restoration agreement onto the marble floor. Graham moved quickly, stepping his polished shoe directly onto the corner of the paper, to hide Darius's printed name before anyone could read it clearly. Renee Caldwell, an investigative journalist standing nearby who covered fraud within the vintage automobile world, saw the entire exchange unfold and noticed the raised seal of a notary stamped across the bottom of the page. Without drawing attention to herself, she quietly photographed what she could see before the paper was swept away, sensing that something far larger than a simple dispute was unfolding in that hallway. Moments later, Darius was escorted out through the same side door he had entered, just as the bidding inside climbed past $8,700,000. And through the closing door, he heard the announcer proclaim that they were approaching a record-breaking sale. Renee followed him out to the parking lot, catching him beside his weathered pickup truck, and asked directly about the contract Graham had trampled and about something Everett Langford once said in an interview she had conducted a decade earlier. Everett had told her then that Black Comet had 2 owners on paper, but only one man who truly understood the machine's heart. Reluctantly, Darius recounted the entire restoration story, explaining that Black Comet contained a verification method that had never appeared in any public catalog or auction listing. Beneath the camshaft cover, hidden from casual inspection, sat a small alloy plate bearing 2 signatures, a 12-character restoration code, and the exact date the engine had first roared back to life after its long silence. Only when both signatures, his and Everett's, appeared together could the vehicle be legally certified as an authentic, fully authorized restoration. Renee asked why such a safeguard had ever been necessary in the first place, and Darius explained that Everett had once been cheated by a previous business partner over a different vehicle entirely years before the 2 men had ever met. Everett had told him then that he never again wanted a machine he loved to leave his hands without absolute certainty about who was allowed to decide its fate. That was why the old man had insisted on hiding the plate deep inside the engine, rather than stamping it somewhere visible, reasoning that anyone willing to forge paperwork would rarely think to fake something buried beneath layers of hardened steel. Darius still possessed his original restoration logbook phase-by-phase photographs, documenting years of labor, and a registered copy of the engine's serial number filed with the American Historic Vehicle Society. Renee checked the public database on her phone and confirmed that Darius's name did not appear anywhere in the auction house's official paperwork for the sale. A legal contact she called by phone confirmed that if the 51% ownership agreement remained valid, the Langford estate had no legal authority to sell the car without his written consent. Worse still, if the certificate of provenance being presented to bidders relied on a forged signature, the entire event could constitute federal auction fraud. Renee urged Darius to publish the story immediately, but he asked her to wait, unwilling to escalate into a public battle before giving Meredith one final chance to stop the sale herself. He sent Meredith a text message containing a photograph of the original agreement, along with a request that someone open the engine casing and verify the hidden signature plate before the sale proceeded any further. Graham saw the message arrive on Meredith's tablet before she did, quietly deleting it and instructing the technical staff not to open any engine panels, citing concerns about damaging the vehicle's presentation value. Inside the hall, Victor Harlan, a shipping magnate known for his blunt honesty, raised the bid to $10 million, and Graham urged Meredith to push the sale toward its conclusion as quickly as possible. Meredith began to feel a creeping unease as she noticed how tightly Graham was controlling every piece of information flowing through the event. She asked him directly why the restoration paperwork never listed the name of the man who had actually rebuilt the car, and Graham brushed the question aside, claiming the restorer had been nothing more than a minor subcontractor, unworthy of formal recognition. Meanwhile, Renee received a scanned document from an archivist at the Historic Vehicle Society, an older filing connected to Black Comet's registration history. The final line of the document stated clearly that any transfer of ownership required the written approval of Darius Whitmore, a sentence that would soon change everything happening inside that gilded ballroom. Victor Harlan had built his shipping empire from a single leased truck 4 decades earlier, and though he now owned more wealth than most small nations, he had never lost his instinct for recognizing when something did not add up. He leaned toward the man seated beside him and muttered that the paperwork on the vehicle felt thinner than anything he had seen cross an auction block in years, a comment that would later prove far more prophetic than he realized. Bidding surged past $11 million, narrowing the contest down to Victor Harlan and an anonymous collector bidding by phone from somewhere overseas. Meredith stood near the wings of the stage, projecting confidence for the cameras, while glancing repeatedly toward Graham, whose composure had begun to look increasingly rehearsed. Renee returned to the ballroom and placed the historic registration document directly into Meredith's hands, watching her read it line by line beneath the glow of the chandeliers. Meredith confronted Graham immediately, and he insisted the paper was nothing more than an outdated technical record entirely separate from any legal claim to ownership. Renee pointed out that the confirmation line had been signed by Everett Langford Darius Whitmore and a licensed notary, hardly the kind of document one could dismiss as irrelevant. Graham demanded that security remove Renee from the premises for disrupting a private business event, and for a moment Meredith hesitated, caught between doubt and the mounting pressure of a sale she desperately needed to close. Ultimately, she sided with Graham, terrified that halting the auction now would cost her company its most important clients, trigger contractual penalties, and possibly push the entire firm toward bankruptcy. Outside, Darius reached the retired notary, who had witnessed the original agreement all those years earlier. And though the man had long since stepped away from active practice, he confirmed that the original filing remained archived at the county records office. Darius asked him to transmit a certified digital copy to the auction house, immediately hoping the paperwork would arrive before it was too late to matter. Inside, the bidding reached $12 million, with Victor Harlan holding the highest offer as the announcer began counting toward the final call. The announcer's voice rang out across the room, 12 million going once. In a quiet corner, Renee streamed the scanned documents directly to her publication's website, and within minutes, thousands of readers were following the unfolding story in real time. A young staffer at the auction house noticed the growing coverage on his phone and pulled up the building's security footage from the front entrance out of simple curiosity. The recording showed unmistakably that Darius had repeatedly asked staff to check the registry before being physically removed, and that Meredith had dismissed him without a single glance at the paperwork he carried. The staffer forwarded the clip directly to Meredith's phone, and as she watched herself on the small screen, she began to understand that her failure was not merely legal but deeply personal. Graham pressed harder, urging her to let the hammer fall immediately, warning that any further delay would make reversing the sale impossible. His urgency only deepened Meredith's suspicion, and she asked him plainly why he needed the transaction finalized with such desperate speed. Graham offered no real answer, his silence stretching just long enough for the doubt in Meredith's expression to harden into something closer to certainty. The announcer lifted the gavel a final time and began the closing count. 12 million, going twice, going three before the words could finish. The doors at the back of the hall swung open. Darius walked in beside Renee past two security guards, who, having now seen the footage themselves, made the quiet decision not to stop him. Darius spoke before the gavel could complete its final motion, his voice carrying clearly across the stunned room. That car cannot be sold. Every head in the ballroom turned toward him at once. Meredith immediately instructed the announcer to pause the proceedings for 30 seconds, ignoring Graham's loud objection that Darius was trespassing on private property in the middle of a legitimate sale. Without raising his voice or making a single dramatic gesture, Darius walked onto the stage and placed the original restoration agreement along with the certified notary filing directly in front of Meredith. He asked only one thing: that someone open the engine casing and verify the hidden authentication plate before another word was spoken about ownership. Victor Harlan announced flatly that he would not release a single dollar until the vehicle's provenance had been fully verified, and the weight of his statement rippled through the room of wealthy onlookers. Facing mounting pressure from her most valuable client, Meredith had no choice but to allow the inspection to proceed. Darius pulled on a pair of gloves and released 3 hidden latches in a precise sequence that no technician on the auction staff had ever known existed. He lifted the panel beneath the camshaft cover, and cameras mounted near the stage immediately projected the hidden interior onto the massive screens above the crowd. Etched clearly into a small alloy plate were 2 names: Everett Langford and Darius Whitmore. Below the signatures sat the 12-character restoration code, matching precisely the documentation Darius had carried with him all evening. The entire ballroom fell into complete silence. Darius explained that the plate did more than simply credit the restorer. It was legally tied to the original ownership contract and to the vehicle's certified historic record. Graham insisted weakly that the plate could have been added afterward, but Darius requested that an X-ray image of the engine block, taken 11 years earlier and recovered by Renee from an archival database, be displayed beside the live footage. The old scan showed the identical plate in the identical position, bearing the identical code, eliminating any possibility of recent tampering. Darius then placed the forged transfer receipt beside a fresh signature he wrote in real time before the entire audience, allowing everyone to compare the two side by side. The auction house's in-house handwriting specialist confirmed within moments that the differences were unmistakable. Darius signed a formal document titled Notice of Ownership Dispute and Withdrawal of Authentication, a filing that immediately revoked his endorsement and formally challenged the legitimacy of the sale. Under the auction house's own written policies, any item facing a genuine ownership dispute or a compromised certificate of authenticity had to be withdrawn from sale without exception, a rule the company's own legal counsel confirmed on the spot. Meredith turned to the announcer and delivered the only order that made sense: cancel the transaction and withdraw Black Comet from the auction immediately. The gavel was lowered onto the podium without ever striking its final blow. The $12 million figure vanished from the display screens above the stage as though it had never existed. Darius looked at Graham and spoke with quiet finality, telling him that the forged signature had brought the car onto that stage and his real one had just taken it back down. The crowd did not disperse after the sale collapsed. Instead, guests demanded answers, refusing to let the evening end without understanding what had truly happened. Victor Harlan phoned his personal legal team and insisted every document connected to the transaction be preserved without alteration. Meredith ordered the entire digital record locked down so nothing could be quietly deleted before investigators arrived. Graham attempted to slip out through a side corridor, but building security detained him at the request of the auction house's own legal counsel. Within the hour, a rapid internal review revealed a disturbing pattern. Graham had uploaded the fraudulent certificate of provenance himself, and he had altered the restorer's field in the official records only 3 weeks before the event. The account designated to receive payment did not belong to the Langford estate at all, but to a shell company registered offshore. A $2 million deposit had been scheduled to transfer overseas the moment the gavel fell, long before any funds could ever have reached the legitimate estate. Investigators also discovered that Meredith's own digital signature had been duplicated to approve several documents she had never actually reviewed. Darius suggested that Graham may have altered physical elements of the car itself in an attempt to erase traces of its true ownership, and a quick inspection confirmed his suspicion when technicians found the exterior chassis plate had recently been swapped for a counterfeit. Had Darius never appeared that night, the eventual buyer would have taken possession of a vehicle built on a fabricated history, while the real evidence of ownership might have been destroyed once the transaction closed. Investigators later pieced together that Graham had been quietly siphoning funds from the Langford estate for nearly 2 years, using a series of small, forgettable transactions that individually raised no red flags, but collectively drained hundreds of thousands of dollars from accounts meant to support a scholarship fund Everett had established for young mechanics from underserved neighborhoods. The Black Comet sale had been intended as Graham's final and largest theft, a single transaction large enough to cover his tracks entirely and allow him to disappear before anyone noticed the pattern. He had chosen the auction specifically because he assumed no one connected to the restoration would ever be allowed close enough to the stage to interfere. That assumption, investigators noted dryly, in their report turned out to be his most significant miscalculation. Renee immediately contacted federal fraud investigators and the county sheriff's office, setting official proceedings into motion before the night was over. Graham tried briefly to shift blame onto a former assistant who no longer worked for the firm, but Darius pointed out a detail that undercut the excuse entirely. The counterfeit document referenced an engine code that Darius had intentionally embedded only in an unfinished draft file, a version that only Graham, given direct access to Everett's private archive, could possibly have seen. That single detail proved Graham had pulled sensitive information straight from Everett's personal records long before the estate was ever settled. Meredith realized with a growing weight in her chest that her own company had come within moments of becoming the unwitting instrument of a $12 million theft. Yet Darius refused to let her frame herself simply as another victim caught in Graham's scheme. He reminded her plainly that she had been warned multiple times throughout the evening and had dismissed every warning because the man delivering it did not look in her eyes like someone who belonged in that room. Officers soon arrived to collect evidence and escort Graham away for formal questioning his composure, finally abandoning him as reality set in. Before he was led out the door, he turned back toward Darius and said bitterly that he could have simply taken the money and walked away. Darius answered him evenly, telling him that his inability to understand why a man would refuse easy money was exactly why he had never understood the true value of the car in the first place. By the time the ballroom emptied, Black Comet remained parked beneath the stage lights, no longer a commodity, but something closer to a witness. Meredith found Darius near the technical staging area, where he was quietly checking the vehicle for any further tampering. She removed the small brass nameplate identifying her as executive director, and admitted without prompting that she had looked at him earlier that evening and decided instantly that he did not belong. She did not try to hide behind procedure or protocol, and instead laid out her failures plainly, one after another, refusing to soften any of them. She admitted that she was the one who never checked the guest registry, the one who allowed Graham to speak over him without objection, the one who prioritized reputation and revenue over simple truth, and the one who let a private prejudice influence a decision capable of costing millions of dollars in damage. She apologized for humiliating him publicly in front of clients, staff, and strangers who would likely never know the full extent of what he had actually accomplished. Darius did not accept the apology, immediately understanding that words offered in a moment of crisis often fade once the crisis has passed. He asked her a simple question. Instead, how many other people had she turned away from her doors over the years, without ever learning their names or their stories, simply because their appearance did not match the image she wanted her? Company to project. Meredith had no honest answer, and her silence told him more than any excuse could have. He told her plainly that an apology only carried weight if it changed the way she treated the next person who walked through her doors with grease still beneath their fingernails. Meredith offered financial compensation for the humiliation he had endured, but Darius refused to accept payment for an insult that no amount of money could properly repair. Instead, he asked her to commit to 3 concrete changes moving forward. First, the auction house would publicly disclose every irregularity uncovered in Black Comet's ownership file without an omission or spin. Second, future auction records would list the full names of every craftsman, mechanic, and technician who contributed meaningfully to a vehicle's history, rather than erasing them from the story entirely. Third, the company would establish a formal verification process triggered whenever a laborer or restorer challenged the stated provenance of an item on the auction block. Meredith agreed to all 3 conditions without hesitation, and she went further, offering Darius a position as an independent consultant on authenticity and provenance for future sales. He did not answer right away, his attention drawn instead toward the long black shape resting quietly beneath the stage lights. A car that had once again survived something far more dangerous than rust and time. Renee asked Darius what he intended to do with Black Comet now that legal control rested firmly in his hands. He looked at the vehicle and remembered the promise he had made to Everett Langford so many years earlier. A promise that the car would always be seen, always be heard, and always be understood as a living piece of history, rather than a trophy hidden away in some billionaire's private vault. He thought back to the countless evenings he had spent alone with the ruined chassis in the early years, running his palm along cracked steel and imagining the sound it might someday make again long before anyone else believed it was possible. He remembered, too, the many times strangers had walked past his garage and assumed the wreck rusting in the corner was destined for a scrapyard rather than a museum floor. If Black Comet ended up hidden inside another private vault, admired by no one but the single wealthy man who happened to own the key, then everything he and Everett had sacrificed to save it would mean nothing beyond the balance of somebody's bank account. In that quiet moment, standing beside the machine he had rebuilt with his own 2 hands, Darius decided that Black Comet would never again cross an auction block. He also made clear to Meredith's surprise that he had no intention of locking it away in his own garage either. 1 week later, a court granted Darius temporary confirmation of his ownership rights, while a formal audit of the Langford estate proceeded under judicial supervision. The original agreement left no room for interpretation. Darius held 51% of Black Comet, exactly as promised more than a decade earlier. The remaining 49% reverted to Everett's estate to be managed strictly according to the terms of the original restoration contract. Victor Harlan reached out privately, offering $7 million for Darius's controlling share of the vehicle, a staggering sum for a share of a single automobile. Darius declined without hesitation. Other collectors soon followed with even higher offers, each one confident that money alone could persuade him to change his mind. None of them succeeded. At a small press gathering held outside Whitmore Heritage Motors, Darius announced his decision publicly for the first time. Black Comet would be placed into an independent preservation trust, shielded permanently from private sale or speculative resale. The car would rotate on display among automotive museums, technical schools, and exhibitions dedicated to industrial history, allowing far more people to encounter it than any private collection ever could. It would still be started and driven occasionally during special commemorative events, ensuring the public could experience the sound of an engine Darius himself had coaxed back to life from a pile of broken parts. He announced, too, that a portion of any future exhibition proceeds would be redirected into the very scholarship fund Graham had spent years quietly draining, a fund designed to train young mechanics from neighborhoods, much like the one Darius himself had grown up in. He wanted those students to understand, in a way no classroom lecture could ever fully teach, that the value of their future work would never be measured by the cleanliness of their hands or the cost of their clothing, but by the integrity and skill they brought to whatever they built. He insisted that every informational placard accompanying the car include the names of its original designer, its original engineers, Everett Langford himself, and every craftsman who had contributed to its long and difficult resurrection. Meredith attended the announcement but did not stand near the podium. Instead, she sat quietly among the technicians and support staff in the back rows. Voss Crown Auctions released a full internal report accepting responsibility for the incident and reimbursed every guest who had attended the disrupted event. Meredith also established an independent verification board, granting Darius formal authority to challenge questionable provenance claims on any future item the company presented. He agreed to serve as a consultant for 1 year, though he made it clear that his garage and the customers who depended on him would always remain his first priority. When a reporter later asked whether he regretted turning down millions of dollars for his share of the car, Darius answered simply that he had not saved Black Comet so that one more wealthy man could own it. But so, the truth about the people who had actually built it would never disappear. 6 months later, Voss Crown Auctions held its first public event since the scandal had unfolded, and the atmosphere inside the building had changed in ways immediately visible to anyone who remembered the previous year. There was no longer a velvet rope dividing wealthy guests from technicians and support staff. Everyone entered through the same set of doors. Painted across the main wall in bold lettering was a simple statement: every machine has a story, and every hand deserves a name. Every item cataloged for auction that evening carried a formal listing of its restorer, its mechanics, and its technical team, a policy now permanent within the company's operations. Meredith stood near the entrance herself, instead of waiting on a raised stage greeting guests personally as they arrived. Darius pulled up outside, in the same weathered pickup truck he always drove, wearing the same charcoal suit and the same worn shoes from months before. His hands still carried the faint permanent traces of engine grease that no amount of scrubbing could ever fully erase. A new attendant at the registration table greeted him politely, asked for his name, and calmly checked it against the guest list without a hint of suspicion. Meredith walked over herself this time, and rather than calling for security, she simply opened the door and told him they had been waiting for him. Inside, Black Comet stood at the center of the room, but there was no price displayed beside it, and no paddle waiting to claim it. A placard beside the vehicle told its full and honest story, listing every name of every person who had ever touched its frame, its engine, or its long and difficult path back into the world. Darius signed the final certification for the newly established Preservation Trust, and the very signature that had once collapsed, a $12 million sale, now stood as a permanent guarantee that Black Comet would never again be sold on the strength of a lie. Meredith asked quietly whether he had truly forgiven her for everything that had happened months earlier. Darius answered that forgiveness was not about forgetting a door that had once been slammed shut in his face. It was about watching carefully to see who she chose to open that same door for next. When the great V12 engine finally roared to life inside the hall, the sound rolled through the room and silenced every conversation at once. Somewhere near the back, a group of young students from a local technical program stood on their toes to see over the crowd, several of them recording the moment on borrowed phones, their faces lit with the kind of wonder usually reserved for fireworks or first snow. One of them, a girl no older than 19, with her own hands stained faintly with brake fluid, turned to her instructor and asked quietly whether she might someday build something worth remembering the way Darius had. Her instructor told her that the only real difference between her and the man standing beside that engine was time patience and the refusal to quit when the world told her she did not belong. No one in that crowd applauded because of what the car might have sold for. They applauded for the man who had created value that money had once tried and ultimately failed to take from him. Darius did not win that night because he became the wealthiest person in the room. He won because when the world saw only a black mechanic with grease-stained hands, he had never once forgotten exactly who he was. And in the end, one honest signature had proven strong enough to defeat millions of dollars built entirely on a foundation of lies.